No, I mean, I'm sure David Cameron's children will get bullied whatever school they went to. It's quite difficult, that thing of bullying. But Mick was always in charge of which schools, and he's done a great job.
For decades, Jerry Hall and Mick Jagger's relationship was sold to the world as rock and roll royalty. A glamorous supermodel and the untouchable frontman of the Rolling Stones, living a love story straight out of a backstage fairy tale. But at 70, Jerry Hall is finally pulling back the curtain. And what she's describing isn't glitter, champagne, and passion. It's betrayal, it's humiliation, and it's a private heartbreak that unfolded in full public view. Because behind the iconic photos and red carpet kisses was a truth few people ever saw. And the deeper Jerry talks about it, the more unsettling the story becomes. Before there was scandal, before there were headlines about betrayal, there was a moment that felt almost cinematic. It was the mid-1970s. Studio 54 was pulsing. The Rolling Stones were untouchable. And Jerry Hall, a tall, Texas-born blonde with impossibly long legs and a laugh that could cut through a crowded room, was becoming one of the most in-demand models in the world. Their meeting wasn't subtle. It wasn't quiet. It was explosive. At the time, Jerry was already linked to Bryan Ferry of Roxy Music. In fact, Ferry had famously put her on the cover of his album Siren, cementing her as a glamorous muse of the era. But when Mick Jagger entered the picture, everything shifted. According to Jerry, the attraction was immediate, magnetic, dangerous, and very public. Mick wasn't just a rock star. He was the rock star. Unpredictable, seductive, and surrounded by chaos. Women adored him. The press obsessed over him. And Jerry, with her statuesque beauty and southern charm, seemed like the perfect match for his wild world. Their relationship didn't slowly blossom. It detonated. Jerry left Bryan Ferry in dramatic fashion, and the tabloids had a field day. Almost overnight, she went from being a rising supermodel to being Mick Jagger's woman. The cameras followed them everywhere. Backstage at concerts, lounging on yachts, stepping out of limousines in Paris and New York. They looked invincible. There were the iconic photographs. Jerry draped across Mick's lap, laughing barefoot on beaches. The two of them wrapped around each other in a haze of cigarette smoke and flashbulbs. They weren't just dating. They were performing a love story for the world. And the world loved it. Jerry later admitted that the lifestyle was intoxicating. Private jets, lavish hotels, a constant stream of artists, musicians, and celebrities orbiting their lives. She was young, glamorous, and completely swept up in the romance of it all. But even in those early days, there were whispers. Mick had a reputation, a well-earned one. Infidelity followed him like a shadow. Stories of groupies, secret flings, and blurred lines weren't exactly rare in the rock world. They were expected. And Jerry knew that when she stepped into his life. The question is, did she believe she could change him? In interviews years later, Jerry reflected on how deeply in love she was. She's described Mick as charming, funny, intellectually curious. A man who could make you feel like the only person in the room. That kind of attention can be powerful. Add global fame and the thrill of being half of rock's most photographed couple, and it becomes almost addictive. By the 1980s, they were more than a tabloid sensation. They were building a family. Jerry and Mick would go on to have 4 children together. To the public, it looked like a natural progression. Wild lovers settling into domestic bliss. And in 1990, they held a lavish ceremony in Bali that was widely reported as their wedding. It was exotic, spiritual, over the top, very on brand. Jerry wore a stunning gown. The photos were splashed across magazines worldwide. After more than a decade together, it seemed like the ultimate confirmation. This wasn't just a rock and roll fling. This was forever. But here's the detail few people focused on at the time. The ceremony wasn't legally binding. It was symbolic, spiritual, romantic, but not official. And whether Jerry fully understood the implications of that at the time remains a lingering question. Because while the fairy tale was being sold to millions, cracks were forming behind the scenes. The touring never stopped. The attention never faded. And Mick's appetite for freedom didn't exactly disappear with fatherhood. Still, Jerry stayed. She defended him. She stood beside him at premieres. She smiled for cameras. She raised their children while the Stones dominated arenas around the globe. From the outside, they were untouchable. A blonde goddess and a rock king ruling their empire. But sometimes the most glamorous love stories are built on compromises no one sees. And as the years passed, those compromises would begin to cost Jerry more than she ever expected. Because loving Mick Jagger didn't just mean loving a man. It meant competing with a legend. And soon, the world would see just how fragile their fairy tale really was. Being in love with Mick Jagger didn't just mean loving a complicated man. It meant sharing him with the world. By the early 1980s, Jerry Hall wasn't just a supermodel anymore. She was the unofficial queen of rock's most notorious kingdom. The Rolling Stones were touring relentlessly, breaking records, and cementing their legacy. And everywhere Mick went, temptation followed. Backstage culture in that era wasn't subtle. It was chaotic, unfiltered. Groupies weren't rumors, they were part of the ecosystem. Entire hotel floors were reportedly blocked off. After-parties blurred into mornings. Privacy was nearly impossible. Jerry has since admitted that she understood the environment she was stepping into. Rock and roll didn't operate by traditional relationship rules. Fidelity was flexible. Or at least that's what she told herself. But understanding something intellectually doesn't make it hurt less emotionally. While Mick traveled the world, Jerry was often home raising their children. For kids, school runs, bedtime routines, all while tabloids published fresh speculation about Mick's wandering eye. Photos would surface. Whispered stories would circulate. Names of models, actresses, and dancers would appear in gossip columns. And Jerry? She stood by him. Publicly, she defended their relationship. She downplayed the rumors. She projected confidence, sometimes even amusement, at the endless stories about Mick's infidelity. There was a kind of unspoken rule in the rock world. Don't embarrass the brand. Because by then, they weren't just a couple. They were a brand. Their image was worth millions. Magazine covers, endorsement deals, the mythology of the Rolling Stones. It all benefited from the fantasy of their glamorous union. Jerry, tall and radiant, became part of the Rolling Stones' visual identity. She was elegance standing next to chaos. But privately, cracks were widening. In later interviews, Jerry hinted at feeling isolated. She described the loneliness of being the stable one while her partner thrived on adrenaline and adoration. Mick wasn't just famous, he was worshipped. And when you're married to someone the world treats like a god, it can warp the power dynamic. How do you compete with stadiums chanting his name? How do you confront someone who has spent decades being told he can have anything, and anyone he wants? Friends of Jerry have suggested that she tried to normalize the behavior, that she convinced herself it was part of the package. After all, she had chosen this life. She had walked into it with her eyes open. But there's a difference between accepting imperfection and accepting humiliation. Over time, the rumors became harder to ignore. Some weren't whispers at all. They were splashed across international headlines. And each time, Jerry was expected to smile through it. There were moments when she reportedly confronted Mick. Moments of tension behind closed doors. But the pattern didn't change. Touring continued. Attention intensified. And Mick remained, at his core, untamed. Jerry once described loving Mick as loving a force of nature. And you don't control a force of nature. You endure it. Still, she stayed. Why? Part of it was love. By all accounts, she truly adored him. They shared history, children, a life built over decades. There's a gravity that comes with that kind of bond. Part of it was pride. Walking away from the world's most famous rock star isn't just a personal decision. It's a public earthquake. Every move would be dissected. And part of it may have been hope. Hope that he would eventually settle. Hope that maturity would shift priorities. Hope that family would outweigh fame. But then, in the late 1990s, something happened that would shatter even the strongest denial. It wasn't just another rumor. It wasn't just another tabloid fling. It was undeniable, documented. and impossible to explain away, because this time there was a pregnancy. And when Jerry discovered the truth, not in a quiet confession, but through explosive media reports, the fairy tale she had spent decades defending began to collapse in real time. The world watched. The humiliation was public. And for the first time, staying no longer looked strong. It looked impossible. What happened next didn't just end a relationship. It exposed a devastating reality Jerry had been living with for years, and forced her to confront a truth she could no longer ignore. By 1998, Jerry Hall had spent more than 2 decades learning how to survive the Mick Jagger universe. She had survived the tours, the rumors, the endless parade of women whose names appeared beside his in gossip columns. She had endured the strange pressure of smiling on a red carpet while the world speculated about what might be happening once the cameras were gone. But there is a point where even the most carefully protected illusion becomes impossible to maintain. And for Jerry, that point came with a name that suddenly seemed to be everywhere: Luciana Gimenez. Luciana was a Brazilian model and television personality who became linked to Mick during the late 1990s. At first, the story fit a pattern the public already recognized. Another woman, another alleged affair, another headline Jerry might be expected to ignore, deny, or outlast. Except this time, the rumors did not fade. They grew louder. Then came the report that Luciana was pregnant. For Jerry, this was not just an allegation of infidelity. It was evidence that the situation had crossed a line that could not be spun away by publicists, explained as gossip, or buried beneath another Rolling Stones tour. A child would mean permanence. It would mean the affair had consequences that could not be hidden. And it would force Jerry to confront a question she had likely spent years avoiding. Had she been protecting a relationship, or protecting an image? The exact private moment when Jerry learned the full truth has never been publicly documented in the neat, cinematic way tabloids often suggest. There is no verified transcript of a confrontation. No reliable account that places us in the room and tells us every word that was said. But the public timeline was brutal enough. The relationship between Mick and Luciana became international news. Photographs appeared. Reports multiplied. And once Luciana gave birth to a son, Lucas, in May 1999, the question was no longer whether there had been a fling. The question was whether Mick Jagger was the father. Initially, Mick reportedly disputed paternity and sought a DNA test. That response only intensified the media storm. Every development was treated like an episode in a scandal the entire world was invited to watch. Imagine what that must have felt like for Jerry. This was the woman who had stood beside him for more than 20 years. The woman who had raised 4 of his children. The woman who had traveled the world with him, defended him, and built a home around the unpredictable rhythm of his career. Now, a deeply personal betrayal had become public entertainment. And unlike previous rumors, there was nowhere to look away. DNA testing later confirmed that Mick was Lucas's father. Whatever ambiguity had existed in the headlines disappeared. The story was no longer a whispered allegation or a paparazzi snapshot that could be dismissed as misleading. It was real. And for Jerry Hall, it was devastating. In May 1999, she filed legal action seeking to end what had long been understood publicly as her marriage to Mick. But then the story took another humiliating turn. One that revealed just how fragile the foundation of their supposed fairy tale had always been. Jerry and Mick had held their spectacular ceremony in Bali in 1990. To the public, it had been a wedding. The images were glamorous, spiritual, and unforgettable. For nearly a decade, the press referred to Jerry as Mick's wife, and the couple themselves moved through the world as husband and wife. But legally, things were far more complicated. In June 1999, a court in London ruled that the Bali ceremony was not valid under English law. The relationship could not be dissolved through a conventional divorce because, in the eyes of the court, there had not been a legally valid marriage to dissolve. Instead, the process became an annulment. That legal ruling landed like a second betrayal. For years, Jerry had lived as Mick's partner in every way that mattered emotionally and publicly. They had children together, shared homes, attended official events, created a life so visible that millions of people saw them as a permanent institution. Yet when the relationship collapsed, she was forced to confront the fact that the marriage she believed she had was not recognized in the way she may have assumed. That does not mean Jerry walked away with nothing. Reports at the time suggested the couple reached a substantial financial settlement, though the precise terms were never publicly confirmed. But the emotional symbolism of the annulment was impossible to ignore. The lavish Bali ceremony that had once looked like proof of commitment now seemed to represent something else entirely. Promise without protection, a fairy tale without legal footing, and perhaps most painfully, a relationship built around rules that seemed to apply differently to each of them. Mick moved through the scandal as one of the world's most powerful performers, a man whose legend had survived controversies, arrests, breakups, and decades of outrageous headlines. The Rolling Stones machine kept moving. The tours continued. The mythology endured. But Jerry had to pick up the pieces of a life that had been publicly defined by him for years. She was not simply ending a romance. She was dismantling an identity. For a long time, the public had treated her as the woman who could handle Mick Jagger, the glamorous partner who knew exactly what she signed up for, the supermodel who could stand beside a notorious rock star and somehow make the chaos look elegant. But the pregnancy changed that perception. Suddenly, the narrative was no longer about a couple with unconventional boundaries. It was about a woman who had been asked to tolerate the intolerable, and who finally reached her limit. Years later, Jerry would speak with more distance about that chapter of her life. She did not always frame it with rage. At times, she expressed affection for Mick as the father of her children and acknowledged the intensity of the bond they once shared. But forgiveness is not the same as pretending something did not hurt. And moving on is not the same as rewriting the past. Because the Luciana affair did more than end Jerry Hall's relationship with Mick Jagger. It forced her to see the full cost of years spent making excuses for a man the world had taught her to excuse. The public saw a rock star caught in another scandal. Jerry saw the collapse of the life she had spent decades trying to hold together. But once the headlines faded and the legal fight was over, another question remained. One that was even harder for Jerry to answer. How much of herself had she given up trying to be the woman who could survive Mick Jagger? When you're 25, you can call it passion. When you're 35, you might call it compromise. But at 70, Jerry Hall calls it something very different. Time has a way of stripping glamour from memory. What once felt thrilling starts to look chaotic. What once felt romantic starts to look imbalanced. And what once seemed like loyalty can begin to resemble self-abandonment. In recent years, Jerry has spoken more candidly about her decades with Mick Jagger. Not with explosive bitterness, but with clarity. And sometimes clarity is even more cutting. She has openly acknowledged that Mick was unfaithful. That it wasn't a secret. That it wasn't rare. In fact, she's admitted that fidelity simply wasn't part of the rock and roll culture she married into. But here's the uncomfortable part. Just because something is normalized doesn't mean it's harmless. Jerry has described convincing herself that she could live with it. That it came with the territory. That loving a rock legend meant accepting certain rules didn't apply the same way they would in an ordinary marriage. That rationalization became survival. Friends have hinted over the years that Jerry often minimized her own pain. She focused on the children, on maintaining a sense of stability, on protecting the public image. There's a particular pressure that comes with being attached to someone like Mick Jagger, the expectation that you should feel lucky, not wounded. Because how could you complain when you're living in mansions, traveling by private jet, attending the most exclusive events in the world? But luxury doesn't cancel loneliness, and fame doesn't cushion humiliation. In interviews reflecting on her past, Jerry has acknowledged moments where she felt emotionally sidelined. She has described Mick as charismatic and brilliant, but also as someone deeply driven by his own needs. The imbalance wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was subtle, a missed milestone, a tour that took priority, a pattern of behavior that never truly changed. Over time, she began to see how much she had shaped herself around his world. Her modeling career, once blazing hot, slowed as she focused on motherhood and supporting Mick's relentless schedule. That was her choice. She has never framed it as something forced upon her. But looking back, she has wondered whether she gave up more autonomy than she realized at the time. There's also the emotional conditioning that can happen in long relationships with powerful personalities. When someone is constantly admired, excused, and surrounded by yes people, confronting them becomes intimidating. Jerry has alluded to the difficulty of holding Mick accountable in a world where so few people ever did. That doesn't mean she was powerless. Jerry Hall was and is formidable in her own right, intelligent, successful, independent, but power dynamics aren't always about money or status. They're about narrative. And for years, the narrative was simple. Mick was the legend. Jerry was the partner who stood beside him. When the relationship ended, she had to rewrite that story. At 70, she speaks about that era with a mix of fondness and realism. She doesn't deny the love. She doesn't erase the joy. But she no longer romanticizes the dysfunction. One of the ugly details, as she has implied, wasn't just the infidelity. It was the erosion, the slow normalization of behavior that chipped away at her sense of worth. The way she learned to laugh off headlines that would devastate most people. The way she internalized the idea that enduring it made her strong. But was it strength? Or was it survival? There's a difference. In hindsight, Jerry has recognized how young she was when she entered that world, and how intoxicating it felt to be chosen by someone so famous. She has spoken about wanting the fairy tale, wanting the family, wanting stability even if it came wrapped in chaos. And perhaps the hardest truth she's had to face is this. She believed the Bali ceremony meant permanence. Even if the law later said otherwise, emotionally she had committed fully. She had built her life around that commitment. And when it unraveled, she wasn't just leaving a man. She was disentangling herself from a version of herself that had existed for over 20 years. That's not something you walk away from unchanged. The public often reduces their story to a headline. Mick Jagger's affair ends marriage. But for Jerry, the ugliness ran deeper than a single scandal. It was the realization that she had tolerated patterns she would never advise her daughters to accept. It was understanding that love doesn't require humiliation. It was recognizing that being the cool girl who laughs off betrayal can come at a cost. And yet, she doesn't describe herself as a victim. That's what makes her reflection so compelling. She speaks as someone who made choices, who loved deeply, endured fiercely, and ultimately decided she deserved more. But what does more look like after loving a man like Mick Jagger? After living in the eye of the rock and roll hurricane? For Jerry, the answer wouldn't come overnight. It would take years, another high-profile marriage, and one more public heartbreak before she fully reclaimed her own narrative. And even then, one lingering question would follow her into every new chapter of her life. Had she finally learned the lesson her younger self couldn't see? Walking away from Mick Jagger wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the end of an era. For more than 20 years, Jerry Hall had been woven into one of the most iconic rock and roll narratives in history. Detaching from that identity required something far deeper than signing legal documents. It required rebuilding herself publicly and privately. In the years following the split, Jerry focused intensely on her children. If there was one role she never treated lightly, it was motherhood. She has often spoken about how protective she felt, determined to give her children stability despite the chaos that had surrounded their early lives. And slowly something shifted. Without Mick's shadow dominating every headline, Jerry began stepping back into her own spotlight. She returned to modeling. She embraced acting and theater work. She gave interviews where she was no longer just Mick Jagger's former partner, but a woman reflecting on decades of experience with wit and candor. There was strength in that reinvention. She didn't rewrite history. She didn't pretend the years with Mick hadn't mattered. But she stopped allowing that chapter to define her entire story. Then, in 2016, came another unexpected twist. Jerry married media mogul Rupert Murdoch. To many observers, it seemed like a surprising pairing, a former rock and roll muse and one of the most powerful men in global media. Yet Jerry appeared genuinely content. Photographs showed her smiling, relaxed, stepping into a different kind of high-profile life. This relationship felt different from the chaos of her past. Quieter, more traditional, less unpredictable. For a while, it seemed as though she had found the stability that once felt elusive. But in 2022, that marriage also ended in divorce. Another headline, another public split, another reminder that even at this stage of life, love can be complicated. Yet something about this second high-profile breakup felt different. Jerry didn't appear shattered. She appeared steady. By then, she was in her late 60s, seasoned by experience, sharpened by reflection. The woman who once tolerated public humiliation in her 20s was not the same woman navigating life decades later. In interviews around that time, Jerry projected clarity, humor, a grounded sense of self that didn't hinge on a partner's fame or fortune. And that's where the story comes full circle. At 70, when Jerry reflects on her relationship with Mick Jagger, there's no frantic need to defend him, no desperate attempt to preserve a fantasy. Instead, there's perspective. She has acknowledged the love. She has acknowledged the pain. And perhaps most importantly, she has acknowledged her own growth. The ugly details of her affair with Mick weren't just about another woman or a scandalous headline. They were about what she accepted, what she excused, what she believed she had to endure to keep a family intact. Now, she speaks about self-worth in a way she couldn't have at 25. She understands that fame can distort boundaries, that power can silence confrontation, that loving someone extraordinary doesn't mean sacrificing yourself in the process. And still, one lingering mystery remains. Jerry has hinted over the years that the final days of her relationship with Mick contained a private turning point, a moment that crystallized everything. Not the pregnancy announcement, not the court ruling, but something deeply personal that made her realize she could no longer stay. She has never fully detailed that moment. Was it a conversation, a realization, a quiet decision made after years of internal negotiation? Whatever it was, it marked the end of the rock and roll fairy tale and the beginning of Jerry Hall as her own headline. Today, she stands as a woman who has lived through glamour, scandal, devotion, humiliation, reinvention, and emerged reflective rather than bitter. But behind her composed interviews and elegant public appearances lies one final piece of the story, a private detail she's only alluded to, a final realization that changed everything. And if that moment were ever fully revealed, it might force all of us to reconsider whether the real tragedy of Jerry Hall and Mick Jagger wasn't the affair that ended it, but the years she spent convincing herself it hadn't already ended long before. Jerry Hall has shared the heartbreak, the scandal, and the hard lessons of loving a rock legend. But there's one private turning point she has only hinted at, a moment in those final days with Mick Jagger that made her walk away for good. What happened behind closed doors that finally broke the illusion? Because when that missing piece is understood, their legendary love story may look less like a fairy tale and more like a warning.